Good morning. It's Sunday, May 15. This morning I'm starting a new mini-series of messages, 3 sermons on the subject of change. Change is something that we all face. It's inevitable, and in fact we have experienced unprecedented change in the last 2 years or so with the COVID pandemic. So much of that change was unwelcome, unprecedented, uncomfortable. So many plans needed to be changed, so many trips and events canceled, postponed. None of that change was very welcome or good. But some change is positive change, and that's what I would like us to think about beginning this morning and for the next couple of Sundays. How God is someone who not only introduces change, but uses change for good and holy purposes in our lives. And so the structure of this 3-week series is going to be on how change begins with us, with every individual human heart, and then it flows out from there to impact relationships and communities beyond ourselves. So this morning we're thinking about how God changes people, and then in the next week we will think of how changed people change churches, and finally how changed churches change the world. So our focus is on how change begins small and on an individual level, and then radiates from that, flows from that to bless communities and change them in meaningful, important ways, so much so that the entire world is changed by these changed communities. Now, when you think about how God changes people, which is our focus this morning, there are a lot of Bible passages, texts and verses that can be read that explain change from a doctrinal perspective, that try to help us understand what that change is like. I thought a good way for us to think about how God changes people, how God changes us this morning, is to reflect on a story, a parable. Jesus so often spoke in parables as a way of teaching. It was an incredibly simple but powerful way of teaching, because these stories invite us in to them. They invite us to reflect not just on a cognitive level, but on an imaginative level, what it is that the point Jesus is trying to get across is all about. And so I'm going to read the familiar parable of the prodigal son, recorded in Luke 15, verses 11 through 32. And I'd like us to think about this story as an incredible story about change. What change is like, how it happens, and what it brings about. So hear these words as I read them to you, recorded in Luke chapter 15. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him." "My son," the father said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." It's an incredibly moving story, and there are so many different layers to this story. You could spend a long time exploring the depths of this incredible parable. But as I said, I want us to think about the story, this parable, this way of teaching, as something that enables us to understand how people change, how God changes people, how God changes us. This is something I want us not only to understand, but to experience. To experience the radical, life-giving change again this morning that only God can provide. As I said, our tendency is to focus on situations and circumstances and people in our lives that we want to change. This pandemic has reminded us of all of those situations that we wish we could change. And so often our focus is on all of these external realities, people we wish would change, situations that we wish would change. But as this parable is inviting us to consider this morning, all change begins with us. We must be willing to change ourselves before we can think of any other individuals or situations changing. It says, Leo Tolstoy famously put it, "Everybody thinks about changing the world, but nobody thinks about changing themselves." That's where all change begins. And we see that in this story. This is a story of repentance, of profound change, of coming home. Years ago, I read an article written by Dwayne Kelderman, who is a retired Christian Reformed pastor. And he wrote a little article on the subject of change, and it was titled, "When People Change." He identified 5 key factors that each play a role in enabling change to occur. Simple change and sometimes very profound change. They all seem to have at least some, perhaps all, of these 5 ingredients. How is it that people change? First of all, people recognize that the status quo isn't working anymore. So often we hear stories or see examples of people who make a radical choice, a sudden decision. And that's exactly what the son in the parable did, isn't it? He decided one day that he had to leave home. Why did he do that? Well, it's because the status quo as he experienced it was no longer acceptable to him. That was a mistake. His dreams of life in the far-off country would never materialize as he thought they might. But he had a dream of another place, another life that was based on a recognition, faulty as it may have been, that the status quo was no longer acceptable. We sometimes hear about people making changes not because they know where they're going, many times they don't, but they change because they know they can't stay where they are. Churches experience this kind of thing. When they want to change, they may not know where they're going to go or what changes they may adopt, but they know they can't stay where they are. The status quo is no longer acceptable. And the son experiences this in the parable a second time, when in the muck and filth of a pigsty, he realizes that that status quo is no longer acceptable. And so he decides to experience change for a second time. He has no idea if going back home will work out, but he knows he can't stay where he is. That's the first primary factor that enables change, the recognition that we cannot stay where we are. Secondly, people change when they get a vision of a better future. Again, we see this clearly in the parable. The young man at home with his father, living a life of luxury, dreams of a better place. He has a vision, a hope, a plan for what might be. And we see that again in the story a second time when he decides that he wants to go back home. That's where he belongs. That's where his ultimate hopes will be fulfilled. He doesn't know what home will be like, if he'll even be accepted back home, but he has a plan, a vision for a better future. He recognizes that even his father's hired servants live better than he was in the pigsty, and so begins the dream to go back home. Thirdly, another factor that plays a role in how people change, there is an emotional relationship with another person or with a small group of people. That emotional connection, that relationship is key. And Dwayne Kelderman highlights the value of friendships and relationships with family members and mentors. Sometimes interventions play a very significant role in highlighting the importance of these relationships where people share how their lives are being impacted in hurtful ways by the choices that others are making. So the emotional connections, the relationships we have with others is also a key factor in how people change. We cannot make people change, but when we are connected with people and when they are connected to us, there's a profound stability and source of strength that enables people to change, perhaps in ways they never could have dreamed possible. As Kelderman puts it in that article I'm referring to this morning, people are loved into change. You can't manipulate or force people to change, but you can love them into change. The best part of the story of the prodigal son is the father's response. You almost get the impression that he's been looking for his son to return day after day, week after week, maybe year after year, hoping to see his son return. And the son has this carefully prepared, well-rehearsed speech that he's ready to give to his father when he sees him, and the father doesn't even let him finish it. There's an emotional, deep and profound relationship that was never sundered, never severed. That is what makes change happen. And when you think about what this parable is getting at in a spiritual way, for all of us who are children of the Father, our Father in heaven, that is the most profound influence and power that enables people to change. We can't change ourselves, but the power of the gospel, the power of God's amazing grace, as we've been reflecting on that for some weeks now, is what enables us to experience change that we cannot produce, but which we gladly accept. There's a fourth factor that plays a role in how people change, and that's the role of making a decision, of choosing to act, charting a new course. We see that in the parable. In the prodigal son who wants to start over, I will go back to my father, he says. That's a decision. That's a choice. It's the heart of repentance. It's what enables change. Kelderman says we practice our way into change more than we think our way into change. He's right about that. So often Christians focus on doctrine, on teaching, on faith in a cognitive level, and that's all very, very important. But it has to get beyond what we believe or understand in our minds. It has to get to our feet, to our hands. It has to be lived out in meaningful, simple, profound ways. We change because we act. We choose to respond to the opportunities that God gives to us. So change happens in a person's life when they move from faith into action, from belief into a way of living. And we change not because we think that this change is a good idea necessarily. We may be very uneasy about it. We might not like it at first, but the more we practice it, the more we get used to it, the easier it becomes. The more we accept change and even begin to like it. There's a final factor in how people change. They reframe their situation, is how Kelderman puts it. They develop a new worldview, a new way of seeing the world around them. The prodigal son is quite certain that when he goes back home, he's going to be a servant. That's what he asks the father in his own mind in that carefully prepared speech. Make me one of your servants. I'm not worthy to be called a son anymore. That was his view of the world, but how that changed when the father embraced him, kissed him, put a ring on his finger, put sandals on his feet, put a robe on his body, killed the fattened calf and celebrated with him. His whole world changed because the father's love enabled that change. That's what enables us to have a wonderful, new, beautiful view of the world. It's because of what God has done for us in Jesus Christ, to bring that change, to enable us to experience the joy of knowing that we are and always will be God's children. That new reality created by God in and through Jesus Christ is what enables us to accept and even embrace change, because we know it's part of God's plan for our lives. Now, this brings us to the older brother in the story, and I'll say more about him next week as we think about how communities, churches especially, need also to change. The older brother stands tall in this story as a representative of people who have not changed, who are all about obedience and external piety, hard work and diligence, and yet their hearts are not changed. Tragically, we see this in many churches, where people rely perhaps too much on outward obedience, pure thinking, right living, and yet their hearts may not yet be fully impacted by the power and the grace of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The older brother in this story is one who has everything figured out. Everyone needs to change except him. The real tragedy in the story is that he always stayed home. He always worked hard for his father, always obedient, and yet he doesn't know his own father. In fact, the grace and kindness and love that his father shows to the prodigal son, his own brother, when he comes home, well, these are qualities that he despises in his father. Not only does he not know him, he despises his father for showing such grace and love to this brother of his. So his heart needs to change. And tragically, there are many people who may look very pure and act very obediently, but whose hearts need to change. God needs to do that, and they need to surrender themselves to that kind of change that only God can produce. Here's how Henry Nouwen puts it in his description of the older brother. Outwardly, the older son was faultless, but when he was confronted by his father's joy at the return of his younger brother, a dark power erupted in him and boiled to the surface. Suddenly, there is a resentful, proud, unkind, selfish person, one that had remained deeply hidden, even though it had been growing stronger and more powerful over the years. What a tragedy. All because of the reluctance to change, to have all of those factors, those 5 factors that Dwayne Kelderman outlines, to be reluctant to embrace them, to understand them, to live in the grace and power of that kind of change. He needed to change the way every person needs to change, the way only God can make it change. Here's a quote from John Maxwell about change. People change when they hurt enough that they have to change, learn enough that they want to change, and receive enough that they're able to change. There's so much gospel in there, a gospel that speaks to our hurt, to our capacity to understand to some degree, and what we receive by God's grace that enables us to change. I hope you've experienced that kind of change, a new life, a new beginning, a new way of looking at the world, yourself and others, God, everything, all because of what God has done for us in and through Jesus Christ. The one who told this story centuries ago is the one who makes all this incredible change and the joy of living in a relationship with God possible. That's the most important change any person can ever experience, and I hope you have experienced it. I hope that this video has enabled you to appreciate it, to understand it, and most importantly, to experience the beauty and joy of that kind of change. And I hope we never grow tired of changing, because God's purpose in our lives is to change us so that we can impact the world around us. And I'll have more to say about that in future weeks. But I hope today has enabled you to understand and experience the love of the Father and the change that we have been able to experience now and will forever enjoy in the beauty of His holiness. Thanks so much for watching. Be well.